Hello my dears, and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and tonight I have 10 books that I think you should read this fall. We've got all kinds of genres in here. There's something for everyone. I'm telling you right now. We're reading all over the place in this video, and we've got some horror, some literary fiction, some cozy, witchy type books. We've got it all. So these are in no particular order. I'm just going to dive right on into them. I was just sitting around today thinking, like, if I could tell you my favorite fall books, what would they be? And now these don't, I mean, the horror ones, those are definitely fall vibes. But for the other ones, they just give me fall feelings. I think most of them either take place during fall or feel like they could take place during fall. I think. If not, you're just going to have to trust me if you're reading it. If you take a recommendation from me and you're like, girl, this is in the summertime, just trust that you're going to get those fall feelings. They fit in to the fall vibes. So like I said, no particular order. First of all, one of my favorite authors, and this is Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. I've done so many book talks on this channel about Alice Hoffman books, including all 3 of the books that come after Practical Magic in the series. There's 4 books. This is the only one I haven't done a book talk on my channel, and this fall I plan to change that. I'm gonna reread it and upload a book talk sometime this fall. This is basically the story of 2 sisters. And maybe you've seen the movie. I also love the movie, but the book is something special. So it's about 2 sisters, Sally and Jillian, and they grow up with 2 aunts, and they're witches. They have magical powers, and they're discovering these powers. And what we learn is that there's a curse placed on the Owens family, and what that curse is any man who falls in love with an Owens woman is just destined to die an early, untimely death. And so this book looks at one of the sisters and her husband and that loss. And then it goes on to be a really beautiful story about the power of sisterhood. And I love it so much. Later books in the series go on to explain how that curse came to be. And what I love about the other 3 books is some are in the past, some are in the future. It's so good. All 4 of them. And this one is, if not my favorite, because I loved them all, but there's just something special about this one. So if you haven't read it, definitely pick it up, especially if you've seen the movie and you liked it. The book and movie, of course, are very different, but it's the same sort of vibes. Next up, we have Allswell by Mona Awad. If you've been following my channel for a while, you will know that 2023 for me has been the year of Mona Awad. I discovered her, I read Bunny, then I read this one, and then I recently read Rouge, and I love her so much. She's a very unique storyteller. Her stories are all so different, so out there. They're like nothing I've ever read before. And this one to me is the one that gives off the most prominent fall vibes. This book is about a teacher, and she is suffering through an extreme life of chronic pain. And she's getting ready to put on a play with her students. They'll want to do Macbeth, but she wants to do Allswell that ends well. And from there, it just goes off the rails in the best possible way, as all of Mona Awad's books do. If you've read Bunny, you know what I'm talking about. And it's the story, all of Mona's books have a fairy tale-like quality. It's something that's very topical, very of the moment, but also with a fairy tale-like quality. And this book, I think, is fantastic. It looks at chronic pain in a very realistic and compassionate way, and then it's also magical and crazy and wild. and I would definitely recommend for the fall. Because I feel like any book that takes place in school, it has fall vibes to me. Speaking of books that take place in school, my next recommendation is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. If you're very online in the book community, no doubt you've heard of this book 100,000 times already, but it's so good and it's so talked about for a reason. First of all, the first book I ever read by Donna Tartt was The Goldfinch, and I loved it. I loved it. It took me a while to get into it, which is similar to this, but once I did, I was obsessed. And again with this is about a group of students who it's hard to even know what to tell you about this. It's about a group of students. It's got a lot of dark academia vibes. If you like that, which I definitely really love those sorts of vibes. And so we got a group of students. They've got some dark things going on. We know right off the bat that one of them is going to die, but we don't know how, we don't know what happens, none of that. So it's kind of a bit of a journey to figure it all out. It's a lot of unlikable characters doing a lot of unlikable things, but in that sort of way that only Donna Tartt could write this. And it's so good. So if you haven't read this already and you like that sort of thing, definitely check that out. Next up, this is where we move a little more into, although The Secret History is also literary fiction, this is also, it's not scary. I mean, it is, but not in the traditional horror sense. We have by Richard Yates, Revolutionary Road. First of all, I don't know if the light is washing that cover out, but it is just beautiful. This is also a movie, I think it starred Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet reunited after Titanic. I think this book came out probably 15, or not this book, this movie came out probably about 15 years ago at this point, and it's so good. And this book was published in 1961, so it's probably the oldest. No, it's definitely the oldest on this list. But it's about a married couple. What are their names? I know the woman's named April. I'll never forget her. I will never forget April. The husband's name is Frank. And so Frank and April, they're living their life in suburban America in the 1960s, and or perhaps the book takes place in the 50s. But they're living their life, and April has bigger dreams. Well, the two of them have bigger dreams. Frank works for a company that's a very monotonous, the same thing every day, office job, pencil pusher type of deal, and he doesn't want that. And April wants to move, I think, to Paris. It's been a long time since I've read this, but I think she wants to move to Paris. And Frank is all in, and they've got plans. They've got big plans, and as perhaps you can imagine, those plans fall apart. They fall apart in the most devastating of ways, and I would recommend this to everyone. Like I said, it's more literary fiction, but it will chill you to your core. This quiet desperation that April feels as she lives a life that she does not want to live. And it's so good. So that's Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates. Next up, we have The Little Stranger by Sarah Watts. Sarah Waters. If you've been around my channel for a while, you know that I carried this book around for about 3 years trying to finish it. I started it, I got about 80 pages into it, and I just couldn't continue for the longest time. It wasn't that I didn't like it, I'm a bit of a mood reader, and so if something's really not clicking with me, I can't just read it. So this kept getting put on the back burner. But finally, last year I read it and I loved it. It's a haunted house story, a ghost story. But it's so much more than that too. It's so good. Sarah Waters is an incredibly talented story writer and or storyteller. And I would definitely recommend that if you're in the mood for a good period piece that's also a haunted house story. I think you would love it. And if it takes you a while to get through that first 100 pages, just know the payoff is incredible if you stick with it. And speaking of haunted house stories, one of my all-time favorites, we have It Will Just Be Us by Joe Kaplan. I love this book so much. I love it so much. Like I said, it's a haunted house story. It's about a woman who returns to her family home when her mom lives there, her sister's there, her sister's pregnant, and she has to go home. And this house has long been haunted. And what's interesting about this house is it's not just haunted by the past, it's also haunted by the future. Like, the house remembers the entire history of the house, whether that history has taken place yet or not. And the way it haunts is visually, and it shook me to my core. It's one of the scariest books I've ever read. It's got a kid in it who's very scary, which kids in horror novels, especially haunted house stories, scare the ever-loving bejesus out of me. So if you love a good haunted house story, definitely recommend It Will Just Be Us by Joe Kaplan. Next up, no fall reading list would be complete without Stephen King. And there are so many great Stephen King books. Misery, loved it. The Shining, loved it. Dr. Sleep, loved it. But where Stephen King really gets me is in his short story collections. I think he is a master of the short story. Sometimes his novels, I'll find myself being like, this could be over by now. He tends to go on a little too long sometimes in those novels. But in his short stories, he will punch you right in the face. And this is my it's so hard to pick, but this one, first of all, the title, the cover, everything. I love this book, and that's Full Dark, No Stars. It has some of his creepiest stories, in my opinion. And if you're new to King and you're like, where do I start? I would suggest starting with a short story collection. It will really endear you to him. I feel like you'll love him. You'll be excited to read more. At least that's kind of how I feel every time I read one of his short story collections. It makes me want to go and dive into one of his novels. And he's just so good, of course. And yeah, it's one of my faves. It's just so many great short stories. Next up, this is for perhaps the younger book lover in your life, but it's just full of fall vibes for me. And that is Gallant by V.E. Schwab. First of all, this cover is beautiful. I would say, now let me preface this by saying I read it and I loved it. And while I read it, I kept thinking, like, 13-year-old me would have been obsessed with it. It's so good. Again, it's sort of a haunted house story. It's about an orphan who, after many years in the orphanage system, finds out that she actually does have surviving family, and they are calling her home. And so she goes there, and it's a whole thing. And it gets spooky in parts. Like, there were even parts that I was like, that got me. But it's great. I would say if you have a reader in your life that is probably 13 to 16 and they love spooky stories, they would love this. They would love it. At least I would have when I was that age. It's so good. And, but even, like I said, I read it and I loved it. So if it sounds like something that you might find interesting, I'd give it a try, even if you're old as the hills like me. The final two, I don't have the physical copies here to hold for you, but we have here The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. This book is incredible, and it doesn't necessarily take place in fall the whole time, but there's something very fall about it. And maybe a good portion of it does take place in fall/winter. I honestly can't remember. But when I think of books to read in the fall, this comes to mind. It's the story again of two sisters, but this time it's taking place during the war, World War II, I believe. And the two sisters are living very different lives. One is sort of a wife who has a home and her husband's gone, and she's being she's the billet basically for a German soldier. He's like, you know, I'm gonna be living here, you can stay here too and cook for me, or you can leave. And she gets to know him, so that's kind of one side of the story. And then on the other side of the story, we have, I think, the younger sister who's kind of getting into the more rebellious side, where she's sort of protesting and propaganda and things like that. And it's a beautiful story. The final, like, good chunk of the book, I just cried. It was so good, so beautiful. I loved it. And finally, this is a new release, and this is The Unfortunate Side Effects of Heartbreak and Magic. If you love a good, cozy, witchy type of story, this is the book for you. It's so good. It's about a girl, a woman, coming to terms with a lot of things in her life. She's got a brother, she's got a grandmother, and they're just sort of, when they were young, they were both told, like the brother and the sister, what their magical powers were going to be. But of course, there's a caveat to everything, and she's worried about losing her powers. And it's just, there's some practical magic vibes in that. It's a whole family of magic, and it's a beautiful story. And I think if you love just those cozy witchy vibes, you would enjoy this one a great deal. So you guys, those are my 10 recommendations for books you should absolutely read this fall. All of them. But if not, maybe pick one or two and enjoy. And if you do, let me know which ones you think you're going to read. And then after you do, come back and tell me what you thought of them. Because I love nothing more than hearing your guys' thoughts on the books I talk about. But that's going to do it for me for today. I hope you had a great day, or are having a great day, depending on what time it is when you're watching. It's nighttime here where I'm filming, but I hope you had a great day. And I will see you guys again really soon. Bye.